Ladies and gentlemen and friends of the Bedeque Area Historical Society, welcome tonight to the first of 8 lectures this summer. Normally it's 6, but we've had two people that come in from other parts of Canada who've requested to give talks here, so we've expanded it to 8. Before you go, make sure you get a list of the talks which are at the door. Nancy has the list there, and it has the whole lot. They're also on our website as well, with more detail on them. I am Doug Sobey, the president of the Bedeque Area Historical Society. The lady at the back is Heather Harris. She was working at the front here earlier. She is our museum operations manager under a 6-month funding agreement with Young Canada Works training in museum activities or operations. And one of our board members, Nancy Waugh, is at the door and selling various things, so as you leave she will grab hold of you. I'll mention those activities later at the end of the talk. I want to introduce our speaker tonight, and it's someone that I first saw, and he'll not remember this, but I saw him at Mount Allison University as a student, United Nations Assembly, and Harry was assigned an Arab country. Was it Saudi Arabia?
France, no, it was France.
Yeah, it was a colleague, a friend of yours from Charlottetown. You were France.
I was France.
Okay, I pictured you in one of those Arab outfits, and it shows you how memory is false. I am sure it was you.
It was a different Mr. Dressel.
And I was one of the Israel delegations, so I thought I was going to say we were opposed at that time, but you were a conciliator at that time. And that was a very long time ago. We were both at school at that time. I have since known Harry and seen him largely in his role as archivist, chief archivist of the province of Prince Edward Island for many years. And then he went on to higher levels in the Department of Education and became the director of various activities, in fact all of the activities which are on my sheet here, of culture, heritage and libraries, and was there for about 20 years or so. Most of his career has been in the civil service and the field of education and history in the province. Before that, he went to, although born in Summerside and connected with the Holman family, a descendant of the Holman family, you were raised in Charlottetown and then went on to Prince of Wales College and other universities. You named 6 here, but I don't have them in front of me. But the 2 I will name are the University of Alberta, where you did postgraduate studies, and Queen's University in Kingston, where you studied history and law at one, and law at Queen's, wasn't it, and history at the other. Throughout his career, Harry has been active in research on many fields, mostly related to Prince Edward Island history, especially contributing many biographies to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. And in recent years, since his retirement, he has furthered his interests in maritime or coastal activities involving shipping and anything connected with the seas of the Maritimes and especially Prince Edward Island. And he's developed a blog which is called Sail Straight, and it's all one word, and I recommend you to look it up when you go home. But the strait is S-T-R-A-I-T, referring to the probably Northumberland Strait, or at least taken from a body of water. So Sail Straight, and there is a lot of information there, postings on it, on the history of the port of Charlottetown, the maritime heritage of Northumberland Strait, and anything related to the waters around Prince Edward Island. Which is why Harry is, the topic that he's going to speak about tonight is, as you see, Days of Oats and Oysters, Glimpses of Bedeque in the 19th Century, and he's talking about the Port of Bedeque and how the involvement of shipping and other activities in that topic. So Harry, I call on you to tell us about Days of Oysters and Oats. Oats and Oysters.
Thank you, Douglas. But there is one part of the introduction which is extremely important, but has been omitted. And that is the fact that I have strong Bedeque roots. Of course. I am one of the Wrights. I am in the book. Doris Haslam's book, Wrights of Bedeque. I suppose half the people in the audience are in the book too, so you're all distant cousins or even closer. But I am descended from William Wright, Nathaniel Wright, James Wright, Elisha Wright, and Constance Wright, who married, mistakenly perhaps not thinking it was Wrights, into the Holman family. So I have some legitimacy, and I can't, I won't have people saying, who the hell is that guy saying you can stand up and talk about the history of Bedeque? I can't, because I are one. There was one small error in your introduction, which I can correct now as well, as no omissions. You said I was born in Summerside. I was born in Bedeque, because Summerside is a part of Bedeque, as we shall see later in this talk. And I must confess to having some people here under misapprehension that we're going to talk about oysters. And we're not going to talk about oysters. I have deferred that to a later date. When Doug asked me to talk about something, I seized on a nice alliterative title, Oats and Oysters, which rolled off the tongue. And at the time I was doing a 15,000-word paper on oyster history in 19th century Prince Edward Island, and I said, well, I'll just add this to the Bedeque stuff. Well, if I added this to the Bedeque stuff, we'd be here at 10:30 tonight, and I'm sure, in spite of the fact that it's air-conditioned, people are not going to want to listen to me for 2.5 hours. So, the talk has been changed. So it's Days of Oats and Horses, glimpses of 19th century Bedeque. Now, the reason I have chosen to talk about glimpses in the history of Quebec comes back to my concept of what history is. And for me, history is related to a jigsaw puzzle. There are pieces that, when you look at them at first, they don't seem to belong with one another. If you're able to connect one or two in one part and then a few pieces in the other part, and you get all the red bits together and you get the horizon line, and you start to form a picture. It helps if you can find corners and edges. And for me, maps and charts are the corners and the edges of the jigsaw puzzle of history. So you'll see some maps and plans in this presentation. For some other researchers, and I know there are some in the audience here tonight, genealogy provides the edges and corners, and you build in from that. The more parts of the puzzle you're able to put together, the more you're looking at what looks like to begin to become a picture of the past. So what I would like to do this evening is take some scattered parts of that jigsaw puzzle of Bedeque history. It's at best an incomplete history. Sometimes you don't know for a long time just what the final picture might look like. And the trick with history is that you're never going to have all of the pieces. Some have been lost or hidden, and some perhaps never existed at all. And history is always a best guess. So tonight I want to talk about a few of the interesting things I have found about Bedeque. Others giving talk in this series will provide more glimpses. As I mentioned, I am a citizen of, or I was originated in Greater Bedeque, or Metro Bedeque, if you will. At the beginning of the 19th century, Bedeque was much bigger than it is now. It was one of a limited number of settlements on Prince Edward Island, whose name is applied to a larger district than at present, like Belfast. There's no town of Belfast, there's no village of Belfast. There is at least a village of Bedeque. Or Tryon. There's not much of a town in Tryon, but there was nothing much between Charlottetown and Bedeque other than Tryon. Those blank pages, those blank pieces of the map had not yet been filled in. So Bedeque is recognized almost as a concept as much as a place. With the growth and development of additional settlements in the area, Bedeque shrank, actually. Initially, it was used, as you see here, to represent all of the areas surrounding Bedeque Bay, all of the rivers that flowed into Bedeque Bay. The watershed area probably describes Bedeque as good as anything else. So, we had lot 17, 19, 25, 26, all legitimate parts of Greater Bedeque. And it wasn't long before other places were named, such as Searletown, Mount Stowe, Wilmot Grove, Freetown, and they all eroded the concept of Greater Bedeque. And of course, the largest loss was the development of Summerside. And although, even by the 1850s, Summerside is referred to as Summerside, Bedeque, part of Bedeque. The rapid development of the Summerside village, and soon to be a town, meant that the fact that what was once part of Bedeque has been lost. Today, Bedeque is unfortunately considered to be part of Summerside rather than the other way around. Bedeque was connected to the rest of the island, and more importantly to the capital, by both road and sea. And getting to Bedeque from Charlottetown by sea was relatively simple, at least in the summer. The Princetown Road, linking the capital with the county town of Princetown on the Malpeque settlement, was one of the earliest to be carved out of the forest, but it ran nowhere near Bedeque. This map from the 1830s suggests that the only road to Bedeque was from the Tryon village. And of course this is an error, but we lack decent mapping for early Prince Edward Island from the time of Holland's survey up until the 1850s. This map, 1833, suggests that Bedeque was unreachable from the interior, but we know from other accounts that this is incorrect. As late as the 1820s, the Princetown Road route was impassable except by horse or on foot, because wheeled carriages could not yet make themselves pass through the countryside. One of the best sources on the state of roads in the Bedeque district in the first half of the century was from Horatio Mann, who in the early 1820s was the proprietor of half of Lot 27 through his wife's connection with the Searle family, and hence Searletown. He visited his estate, her estate actually, for the first time in 1821, and at least 7 other occasions kept extensive diaries, at least 3 of which have survived, and they document his trips in 1821, 29, and 1840. In 1821, he wrote of a 2-day journey that it required through the middle of the island to get from Charlottetown to Bedeque. Quote, "We hired a gig for the first 17 miles where we were put up for the night at one Bagnall's, a log house situate by a creek in the woods. I cannot speak much in favor of the accommodation, but it was sufficient. We departed early in the morning, each riding on horseback, there being no road for a carriage cut through the woods. We made our way under an avenue of timber, but I fear I saw nothing but woods off in every direction. We rode at one stage upwards of 20 miles ere we came to the appearance of any sort of a house." And what we're talking about is the distance. Haslam's would have been just off the map. And there was a road that ran diagonally through the St. David's Parish to connect. So 20 miles through the woods and nary a house. At last, at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon of Sunday, the 5th of August, we arrived at a decent sort of building called Smith's Hotel. And I wish I knew where Smith's Hotel was, because then we could at least figure out where the road ran. Here we stayed for over 2 hours. After we progressed on our journey, greatly favored by the coolness of the weather, which prevented those annoying animals called sandflies, which, if anything, were worse than mosquitoes, we arrived at Mr. Wright's of Bedeque in the evening at sunset. Man spent 2 days meeting with tenants and transacting business and set out to return to Charlottetown, but the other land route available, heading through the Tryon settlement. At the time, this line of road was through those shore settlements such as Cape Traverse and 7 Mile Bay. My attorney, Mr. Binns, Mr. Cameron, and myself mounted our horses to resume our journey to Charlottetown, returning a much nearer distance than we came. The same scene of woods, 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 woods served us until we arrived at a house of entertainment, where we partook of some refreshments, after which Mr. Binns and myself got into our gig, which we had left there. A distance of only 17 miles to Charlottetown, at which place we arrived about 11 at night. I felt indeed truly glad when I arrived at this place, being extremely fatigued from riding so far on horseback, say, going and returning about 80 miles, also 34 miles in a gig. In 1827, the colony appropriated £1,000 to complete and improve the Great Western Road to Princetown in Bedeque, and a lesser sum for the road connecting Elliott River and Tryon to Bedeque. And these improvements allowed the mails to go through from Charlottetown to Princetown and returning every week in summer and every 2 weeks in winter via Bedeque, where a post office was opened. And the same year, a new line of road, the Anderson Road, was opened by the gratuitous labor of the Bedeque inhabitants. Now, I came up from Charlottetown this evening on the Anderson Road. Anderson Road we call the Kincora Road these days, but it was the Anderson Road. It had not yet been opened. In 1829, a few years later, man recorded another visit to Bedeque, taking the same route as he had 8 years earlier. This morning early I went off for Bedeque, breakfasted at Bagnall's, 17 miles from Charlottetown, then proceeded on a further 7 miles to a place called Haslam's. I ordered dinner, expecting my agent, Mr. Pope, and at last he came with Mr. John Wright from Bedeque with a horse for me also. After dinner we started on our journey, say, another 20 miles further. Being unaccustomed to travel on horseback, I was, as the reader may suppose, greatly fatigued. I arrived at Mr. Pope's at 8 o'clock. As respects the journey, only one scene duly presented itself, say, burned and green woods. The road certainly improved since my journey of 1828, and from great fatigue, I retired to rest early. And again, man returned via the Tryon settlement, and after viewing the progress on the Anderson Road, which headed and extended through at least to the Kincora area, it was still far from completion. It will also be carried through the lot at 67, Miss Fanning Estate, if the other proprietors will go on the same, which is finally will bring the distance from Charlottetown to Bedeque, a distance of only 28 miles in lieu of 42 or 45 miles. Man's journal for 1840 contains less detail, but notes he described the roads as being excellent, with new farms and log houses being cleared all along the route. Meanwhile, the road network in the Bedeque area was expanding, and by the time Condell's map of 1851, a later variant shown here, was published, virtually all of the roads that exist in the Bedeque area were already in place. There were only a few additional roads. So between 1830 and 1850 was a time of intense work in developing a road network. And the road network, of course, led to settlement. In some cases, settlement preceded the roads. But obviously, what was happening in the Bedeque area, this was a thriving and growing community. By 1863, This is what the area looked like. This is the 1863 lake map, which shows almost all of the residents. You can see that by this time, Bedeque had been fragmented into places like Lower Bedeque, Centerville, Central Bedeque, North Bedeque. There was no South Bedeque, however. There is Searletown instead. So, the road network was well established. What about the sea routes? The Port of Bedeque. Bedeque was the site of a good harbor, but not a great one. Captain Bayfield, in his 1851 sailing directions for the Gulf and River St. Lawrence, acknowledges that past Indian Island, which is in the center, now called Holman Island, and through the kindness of the Bedeque Historical Society, walking tours are being arranged, which I hope to take part in myself at some point. Past Indian Island, there was a protected anchorage in 5 fathoms of water. That's about 30 feet of water, which with spring tides gave water enough for the largest ships. But the route into the anchorage was such that, quote, no directions would enable a stranger to enter the harbor without great risk of accident. He therefore considered the assistance of buoys and pilots to be indispensable and advised anchoring outside the bay until a pilot could be obtained. This is a tricky channel today. I've sailed into it myself in a much smaller vessel, and it would be very easy to end up on the sand. Imagine a time when there were no buoys, there were no lighthouses, there were no harbor lights. Very, very difficult. And in spite of the fact that the harbor looks great on the map, once you got in, it's not as large as it looks. The Wilmette River to the northeast has only 2 or 3 feet of water, and it was obstructed by oyster beds. On the southern part of the Bedeque Harbor, it extended 1.5 miles past the island, but this arm, the Dunk River arm, was also closed by mussel beds, leaving only a narrow channel 4 feet at low tide. As you can see right at Hurd's Point, there's a notation on the map saying oyster beds. And that effectively meant the height of navigation for larger vessels. Hope Shipyard, which can be seen on the bottom, was above the oyster beds, and ships launched there had to be taken down to high water, and in some cases the channel had to be excavated by hand to allow passage for the ships to be taken from the shipyard to deep water. One of the indicators of progress in the Bedeque area and its increasing trade was to be found in the number of new wharves built in the area. All across the colony in the 1830s, there had been only a single customs office. So the captains had to travel to the capital every time they wanted to clear a vessel. And they had to pay port fees. You can imagine what this meant for someone who had come into Cascompec or Bedeque Harbor. They would have to take that arduous journey, taking 1 or 2 days, to get to the customs office in Charlottetown, pay their fees, and come back to their vessel before they were able to sail. And there was considerable agitation to develop sub-collectors of customs at regional ports of entry. And finally, in 1835, the legislature agreed to the request, and a number of areas outside Charlottetown became outports or customs ports, one of which was Bedeque. And not surprisingly, Joseph Pope was named collector. He was the local MLA, he was the local Justice of the Peace, he was the local collector of offices, apparently, each one of which had some sort of fees attached to it. He gained money on every transaction registered at the port. In 1835, Bedeque was the 5th busiest port in the colony, behind Charlottetown, a long way behind Charlottetown, but also trailing 3 rivers, Cascompec and Colville Bay, now better known as Surrey. However, being a customs port really didn't mean anything as far as the development of infrastructure went. Smaller vessels of the period were often beached for loading or anchored and had material taken out to them in small boats, or sometimes at low tide even in wagons. It would be 20 years before the wharves extended into deep water enough to tie up a vessel. The first mention of a wharf at Bedeque was not until 1834, when 100 pounds was allocated for a wharf on the south side of the Dunk River at Bedeque. And that was probably at Pope Shipyard. But even before that, there was some sort of landing area, even though a wharf had not been built, because there was considerable trade even in those early years. A petition in 1836 noted that vessels of more than 20 tons could not load above Hurd's Point, owing to the oyster beds blocking the channel, and access to the shore at Hurd's Point was privately owned. The government was asked to purchase a right-of-way, and 2 years later, a request was made for assistance in building a wharf at Green Shore on the north side of the bay. We shall return to Green Shore later. This was granted on condition that the local inhabitants raise 50 pounds on their own, and as soon as they opened a road from Darby's Portage to Cairns, and that actually road is the road which is now the road running through Summerside. Cairns is on the west side, and the Darby property is in St. Elmunds. So that was the first road actually passing through what is now Summerside. And that was in the late 1830s. The wharf was apparently built, as 2 years later, they asked for more funds to extend the wharf. And when Captain Bayfield surveyed the area in 1841, he included a wharf on the southern side of Lot 17, as we saw in an earlier slide. By 1843, the request was to complete the wharf at Green Shore. And in that year, additional funds were provided for wharves at Bedeque, Hurd's Point, and Green Shore. This continued to be an almost routine request, although through the next few decades, what wharves there were gradually being built out to the channel. But it was decades before a seagoing ship could actually tie up at a wharf. A wharf that extended into water which was dry at low tide was wonderful at high tide, but useless at low tide. So the race to get a wharf out to the channel was the one that apparently Green Shore won. In 1852, and this is the first time I have seen in print the word Summerside, a petition was extended to extend the wharf at Summerside, Bedeque. And that's the earliest reference I've seen to that name. Bedeque sat squarely on one of the major shipping routes in the Gulf region. And Northumberland Strait was both a highway and a barrier. At a time that overland transportation was almost non-existent, communication both within the colonies and between the colonies was by sea. As early as the 1820s, there were packet sailing vessels subsidized by the Crown, usually schooners or small brigs, traveling on a regular weekly service between Bedeque and Baie Verte, and later from Bedeque to Shediac. However, the greatest change to transportation in the Gulf area was the coming of the steamship. For a brief shining moment, it looked as if Bedeque could have been a port on a shipping network in which Samuel Cunard played a leading role. Steamers had come to Northumberland Strait in the 1830s as crossing from Pictou to Charlottetown was instigated. An offer from Samuel Cunard seemed like it might put Bedeque on the map. In 1831, he had extensive business interests through his family in the Miramichi and in the Nova Scotia coal fields. And in exchange for an annual grant, he offered to put a vessel on a weekly route from Pictou to Charlottetown and Miramichi, regularly stopping at Bedeque. However, the agreement offered by the PEI legislature made no mention of a trip to Bedeque. And the whole matter was registered as moot when Cunard dropped the Bedeque call, but also any mention of the Miramichi, as he was unsure that the vessel he had the capacity to do the return trip in 1 week. And that was the end of Cunard's interest in Bedeque. However, the general awareness brought about by Kennard and the proposal stimulated desire for steam connection, and for the rest of the decade, an on-again, off-again service was offered between Pictou and Charlottetown, with occasional forays to Miramichi, but there was no indication that the hoot of the steam whistle was heard in Bedeque. In 1841, dissatisfaction with the Nova Scotia-based steamers led to the creation of the PEI Steam Navigation Company, which was island-owned. Over £1,000 was expected from the provincial grants from PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. That didn't come through. About £900 in revenue was expected from Charlottetown to Pictou, £1,500 from trips to the Miramichi, and £200 annually from stops in Bedeque. However, when the sales of shares of the company fell short of expectation, the government of Prince Edward Island passed legislation to purchase a block of shares on condition that the steamer call at Pictou and Charlottetown and Miramichi, stopping weekly at Bedeque every second week and going to Georgetown every second week. And of the 112 names on the list as shareholders of the island-based company, about a dozen of the entrepreneurs were from the Bedeque area. So they were in right at the beginning. The company purchased a used packet steamer, the St. George, launched in 1831, which had been operating between Liverpool and Irish ports. The ship was 135 feet long, had recently been refurbished boilers. Service started in August of 1842 and closed with the closing of navigation in December. Revenues for the year had not met expectations. Although the directors blamed this on, quote, the general slackness and embarrassment of mercantile affairs, quote, and the unusually stormy and tempestuous season. The detailed expenses told a different story, and sadder. The revenues between Charlottetown and Pictou averaged £26 per trip. Those to the Miramichi, £35 per trip. Calling it back at Bedeque brought the company only £6 per trip. And Georgetown averaged only £4. It was obviously that the directors had a ship on their hands which was too big for the goods carried and too expensive for them to operate. And part of the problem arose from the requirements of the public-private partnership with government funding which mandated specific trips to specific ports, including Bedeque. Not the first time public-private partnerships has caused problems. In 1843, there was a £14 profit on the books, but the accounts hadn't recorded all the expenses, so no dividends were paid. In 1844, the government restrictions on the service were finally relaxed, and the company was free to develop its own routes and scheduled to try and chase revenues. The trips to Georgetown were dropped. The trips to Bedeque continued, but with less frequency. But the directors concluded at the end of the year that, quote, the present traffic is altogether unproductive of profit for the shareholders. The company limped along for another year, and although the St. George still stopped at Bedeque on its way to Miramichi, it continued to be a losing proposition. The Miramichi Gleaner reported that on one trip, not a single passenger had embarked at Bedeque, and the only freight was a basket of eggs. The vessel was put up for sale at the end of 1845, was sold to a Quebec merchant. The company looked for a cheaper boat, but was unsuccessful. For the next decade, steamer traffic across the strait was sporadic, and in some years, non-existent, as vessels such as James Peake's Rose and the New Brunswick-owned ferry Queen, which was wrecked with loss of life in the 1853 season, loss of 10 lives. However, there still seems to have been some traffic to Bedeque. As late as last night, I was still researching this, and I came across something which I had never seen before. A vessel called the Western Miller stopped at Bedeque during the 1850 season on its passage between Halifax and Quebec. So there was regular steamer service. It stopped at Pictou, It did not stop at Charlottetown, but it did stop at Bedeque and Shediac and Rishabukto and Miramichi and Quebec. In 1860, the steamer Princess Royal was providing regular service between Shediac, Miramichi, and Bedeque. The fare from Shediac to Bedeque was $1.50. When I worked for CN on the ferry, the fare was 90 cents. So we made some progress in a century or more. Now, have I lost track of these? Yes. World traveler Isabella Bird visited Bedeque in 1854. She was unimpressed with Bedeque, and even less with the steamer Lady Lamarchant. After a brief stop in Bedeque where the ship had to anchor off as the wharf did not yet extend into deep enough water, she retreated to the cabin, where she wrote, "The prospect which appeared through the door was not calculated to please. It consisted of a low, dark, and suffocating cabin filled with men in suits of oilskins, existing in a steamy atmosphere loaded with the odors of India rubber, tobacco, and spirits. The stewardess was ill, and my companions were groaning, unheeded babies were crying." Unquote. As regional transportation improved, Bedeque began to be part of a network. By the 1850s, one could travel from Boston to St. John by steamer, thence by road or steamer to the bend of the Petitcodiac, soon to be called Moncton, and from there by road to Shediac, and there you could board a steamer for Bedeque. In 1860, the railway opened between St. John and Shediac, and Bedeque became a more regular port with vessels such as the Westmoreland, which left Shediac on Mondays and Thursdays for Charlottetown and Pictou, calling at Bedeque, and returned on Thursday and Saturday, again calling at Bedeque. And for those anxious to avoid the unpleasantness of the sea voyage, a regular stagecoach for the trip from Bedeque to Charlottetown could be booked. Now, it was a constant source of irritation that the steamer service across Northumberland Strait was handled by New Brunswick companies, and that the island subsidy to carry the passengers and mails was going to foreign pockets. Finally, in 1864, a second locally owned Prince Edward Island Steam Navigation Company, brilliant originality with naming, it was incorporated. The company commissioned a new vessel, the Princess of Wales, to be built in St. John for the service between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, and its arrival was memorialized by poet laureate, unofficial poet laureate, John LePage, in a multi-stanza poem which included the verse, "And we in this isle see our Princess of Wales, a splendid new steamer, complete in details for the transit of passengers, baggage, and mails. Too long have we been what our neighbors call green, our improvident folly transparently seen, sending thousands abroad each consecutive year to pay for the use of a steam whistle gear." And with this ship, and the addition of the ex-Civil War blockade runner, the St. Lawrence, seen here, truly regular daily service between Shediac and Bedeque was established. Except by this time, the island terminus was no longer Bedeque, but the little wharf at Green Shore, which had grown seemingly overnight to become Summerside. Now, Summerside had its growing pains, and as the first island port of call for those travelers doing the Canadian or maritime tour, it received a good deal of critical analysis that spoke to the unplanned nature of the community's growth. From 1868, a visitor from Emporia, Kansas wrote, quote, "The little village of Summerside, viewed from the sea and bathed in the bright glow of the afternoon sun as the sun unclouded orb lowered towards the horizon, looked very pretty and inviting. That circumstance had weight in our determining to stop here, but appearances are sometimes deceptive. They were in this case, for we found the village to be a small huddle of wooden houses and the inhabitants a set of dirty, lazy, ignorant scallywags, for the most part with scarcely life enough to chew tobacco. The Montreal Witness had a reporter in the same year. Then we reached Summerside, a more active place for its size than Charlottetown. Here the handbill, the auction, the peddling cart, everything that speaks of high pressure and go ahead are the rule. And when I have said this and have spoken well of Bedeque oysters, I have described Summerside, a town which a few years ago was yet to be, but which is now fast centralizing the scattered trade of the western part of the island. Summerside had arrived, but not in the eyes of everyone. 6 years later, a visitor writing for the Boston Globe said, "Man, however, has hardly done his part towards improving this fair Eden. For Summerside, where you will first land if coming from New Brunswick, is even a more forsaken place than Shediac. And your chief impressions of the town, if you stay but for a short time, and will be a row of extraordinarily mean-looking houses planted in the midst of an immense pasture of livestock composed equal parts of scurvy dogs, draggled geese, and dirty children." Now, to be fair, Summerside fared no worse than Charlottetown, which was often described as a boring and featureless, and it lacked the drive and industriousness of Summerside, which some authors praised as being possessed of the boosterism of a town in New England, which was high praise indeed from our southern cousins. And now another fragment, another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. The deeply indented coastline of the island meant that many journeys were interrupted by rivers and bridges and were often well upstream. Across the colony, ferry crossings were established in many locales, such as the Grand River Ferry, the Lot 11 Ferry at Walshtown, west of Summerside, Fife's Ferry at New London, and a number of ferries in Charlottetown Harbor and at Georgetown. A trip from Bedeque, the Bedeque area south of the Wilmot River, to Greens Wharf or Summerside to the north necessitated a lengthy trip to river crossings over the Dunk and the Wilmot. The shorter route directly across the harbor from Bird's Point Wharf to Green Shore was obvious, and there was likely a common use from early date, but it appears that it was not until the 1870s that a ferry was put in place. A contracted steamer, the Jenny B, was in use in 1879, and 6 years later the ferry was running 3 times a day with a dredge channel to the wharf. And that year the Charlottetown Examiner commented that, quote, "The Bedeque people now have one of the finest wharves on the island, and a good deep water channel leading to it. This ferry seems to have operated right into the 1930s. But as roads across the island improved, many of the local small ferries, including the one at Herd's Point, were discontinued." I haven't yet been able to find out exactly when the Herd's Point ferry stopped. Herd's Point Wharf is long gone, so, but I suspect that it probably ended at about that time. Now, back. Way back. The population of Greater Bedeque had advanced steadily through the 19th century, and the area has some of the finest agricultural land in the colony, and this is reflected in the shipping records, which provide records of the level of business and the value of shipping. Separate records for the Port of Bedeque are available from 1833 to the time of Confederation, and the changes in shipping are a record not only of how much shipping took place, but how it changed over the years. Not often considered is the value of the farmer that the first crop ahead, a crop that he neither planted nor maintained, but one which was necessary to the advancement of any farm. Timber was a valuable resource, but could generally be harvested but once. The forest could be turned into revenue in 2 ways. The first of these was by using the abundant wood to build ships. And between 1791 and 1943, 334 vessels were built in the Bedeque area, most in two periods, between 1815 and 1830, and between 1860 and 1875. And during the latter period, the industry was dominated by members of the Pope family, who were involved in some measure in at least 72 vessels around Bedeque Bay. While vessels were built all over the area, after 1860, the industry was centered in the rising town of Summerside, where between 1862 and 1866, a 4-year period, 53 vessels were built. Some of them were even built indoors in sheds built over the slipways. This is a very rare way to build ships, certainly in Atlantic Canada, and maybe unique to Summerside. There are varying views of shipbuilding on Prince Edward Island. On the left, my left, is the Undine, which was one of James Pope's ships. This beautiful this beautiful oil painting depicts the vessel. And that, I think, reflects what most people think island shipbuilding was about. The other is a small schooner, which probably reflects more of the reality. Schooners were the pickup trucks of the era. The ocean liners were few and far between. Most of the ones that were built were sold immediately on building into the British trade. The working ships, the vessels that came in and out of Bedeque Harbor each day, were more like the other, more humble, with patch sails, deck cargoes, minimal crew, not well kept up, carrying produce, animals, timber, whatever they could. The majority of the vessels built in Bedeque, as was the case for the island as a whole, were built for resale in the British market, and they followed overseas trends. Of the vessels, the brigantine rig was the most saleable, reflecting British demands for coastal vessels rather than deep water ships. And although vessels per se are not included in the Customs House records, shipbuilding did have an impact on many of the chief areas of import. Many of those were materials associated with shipping and shipbuilding, such as cordage, sailcloth, iron, and anchors. This was material being shipped into the Port of Bedeque. It wasn't being used by the people of Bedeque, except in the building of ships, which were then sold out of Bedeque. But it was still trade, and it was still significant. The other harvest of the forest was the wood itself. Processed to some extent from the several mills across the region, the Customs House records, Customs House records a consistent export of wood products. In 1850, only an average year for exports, actually part of the downhill slide, the port saw the shipping of some 43,000 feet of deals, or heavy planks of about 3-inch thickness, 5,000 feet of boards, 225 tons of birch timber, 715 juniper knees, which were used in the building of other ships, and other lesser quantities of juniper timbers, lath wood, and handspikes. Now, almost all of the timber shipped from Bedeque went directly into the British market. But with the passage of time, the clearing of lands, and the decline in shipbuilding meant that the days of Prince Edward Island being a timber colony were soon a thing of the past. Bedeque's other export was agricultural products. As a long-settled part of the island, it was the early leader in clearing of land and developing of agricultural potential. In 1833, as shown by this map, along with Malpeque, it had the highest level of cleared land per capita in the colony. 30 years later, it had as many cattle as people, and agricultural exports dominated the Customs House returns for the rest of the century. Now today, Bedeque area is known as good potato land. But in the 19th century, oats was the dominant crop. In 1847, 5 acres of oats were planted for every acre of potatoes. In a horse-drawn economy, oats were the fuel. And Bedeque export figures reflect this both in volumes and in value. In 1853, for example, almost 87,000 bushels of oats with a value of 8,000 pounds were shipped from the Port of Bedeque. A small amount of oats was shipped to Great Britain, but the majority went to other British colonies. That is to say, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Newfoundland. The same year saw exports of all other vegetables, mostly potatoes, just over 2,000 bushels, 152 pounds, barely a 20th of the value of oats that were shipped. This pattern was to hold true for the remainder of the century, although the increase in trade with Great Britain increased so that by 1867, nearly 50% of the exports for the island as a whole went across the Atlantic. We had lost the American market, or had not yet developed it, with the end of reciprocity. 2/3 of the value of island exports was in oats, and Bedeque continued to be a major shipping port until the end of the century. Now, at this point, some of you may be wondering what happened to the horses in the days of oats and horses. And in my collection of jigsaw pieces, I discovered something that really surprised me. Often when you're researching, especially figures like export figures, you have a certain expectation of what you're going to find. And it's very rare that you sort of see something and look back and say, oh my God, where did that come from? So 1854 had a surprising fact. That year, the most valuable product shipped was livestock. Sheep, cattle, horses. There had always been sheep, cattle, and horses shipped out of Bedeque. But horses alone almost exceeded the full value of all the oats shipped out of Bedeque, with an astounding 332 horses shipped in 1 year, worth 7,700 pounds, that were loaded aboard vessels in Bedeque Harbor. Now this was at a time when a lot of the larger ships couldn't even approach the wharf because it was... So I just have trouble thinking how they loaded all of those horses into those schooners or larger ships, often from smaller boats or from wagons which had gone out into the water. And I thought, well, there's obviously a mistake here. Maybe it's 32 horses, not 332 horses. But the following year saw the same pattern, and in the 5-year period in the 1850s, almost 1,000 horses were shipped out of Bedeque. There's your days of oats and horses. Almost all of those went to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, although some may have been shipped onwards. I'm not sure what the reason is. It may be the development of timbering in the New Brunswick woods, calling for a lot of small Acadian horses, which were bred here on Prince Edward Island as a specific type of horse, small, tough little horses. Or it may be that Bedeque people were very good at breeding horses and had surpluses, but every time I do research to give a talk, I find something new that I could go back to the records tomorrow and start a whole new search. Thus far, I have resisted this, and maybe I can inspire some other historian to look at the history of horses in Prince Edward Island. So, although there's no doubt of the importance of horses in the 19th century, cities, farms, everything ran on horsepower. The horses ran on oats. The oats are explainable. I have no problem with a huge oats export. I don't know about the horses. So, for a short time, it was the leading export of horses in the colony, more than any other port, including Charlottetown. So, the jigsaw puzzle, that's the history of Bedeque, is far from complete, but I hope that these few pieces of the picture lead to a more complete understanding of elements of the history. Even though I have provided a few of the edges and corners and have managed to show how some of the elements might fit together, I'm conscious of the fact that there are other people in this lecture series which will be providing other parts of the puzzle. And maybe if you're lucky enough to be able to come to all 8 lectures, you'll have a better picture of what Bedeque's history is. And there's still a section off to the side of my work relating to the oysters of Bedeque Bay and Harbor that must be pulled together perhaps another time. Thank you. I can take questions. I'm not sure I can answer questions. I can always take questions. And as I once told a close relative, if somebody asks you a question, there's a chance that they don't know the answer themselves, you can probably get away with a lot. So are there questions? Mr. Glenn?
Yes, quick question. The map that you showed had numbers in the water. They were fathoms?
Yeah, those were feet.
Oh, feet.
Yeah.
Okay. They were very
That chart was in feet.
feet. Okay.
So it shows
Shallow.
waters of off what is now the Summerside Wharf, it's as much as 40 feet, in behind Indian Island, 30 feet, but once you get to Hurd's Point, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet. Yes?
In your research regarding the name of Bedeque, I grew up in the community, and we seem to always be of the opinion that the name Bedeque is a French rendition of an indigenous name. Did you ever encounter anything in that regard?
That is not an area that I have any more knowledge than what you have suggested, because all of the sources that I have seen concerning the origin of the name Bedeque seem to be that it is a French corruption of a Mi'kmaq word, and I've seen various translations of that. I can remember when EPTEC, National Exhibition Center, was being established, there was a great controversy as to whether EPTEC was a proper translation of the word the hot place. And I know Alan Rankin, who was on the management of that, was on the hot seat for quite a while trying to explain that. But I do not have a more accurate translation of the word Bedeque. But it is, I will say this about it, it is one of a very small number of names which survived Samuel Holland's renaming of everything that didn't move on Prince Edward Island. If you compare Prince Edward Island to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, the number of indigenous names which have survived for the communities and natural features, it's insignificant compared to others. And it's because Samuel Holland did such an extensive renaming process. He just assumed nothing had ever had a name before he arrived. And he named from 300 to 500 different places, place names on Prince Edward Island. Almost all people in the British elite that he wanted to curry favor with. There's a very excellent volume that has been done on Samuel Holland and his survey, and there's a chapter on the naming, and I commend it to everyone. And as I say, with the exception of places like Cascampec and Bedeque, there are not too many indigenous names which survive Samuel Holland.
Tignish, Miminigash.
Ah, yeah, there's a few.
Holland did record a few of the French names. And what he intended for Bedeque Bay was Halifax
Yes.
Bay,
Yeah.
which was named after the Earl of Halifax, who was the head of the Southern Department, I think it's called the Colonial Department. But he wrote Halifax on his map. Halifax Bay in big letters by the French
French colony.
called Bedeque.
Yeah.
But somehow the name, Halifax didn't take off at all.
Well, there's Halifax Parish too.
Yes, the parishes didn't really get established.
George?
I'm from the Evangeline region, and still today, there's some people who call Summerside the Chick, the wharf.
Oh, yeah.
And I hear that also in English, it was called the wharf at one point. So that would be reference to the Queen's Wharf?
Well, it was the Green Shore Wharf. I don't know when it started to be called Queen's Wharf, but it was sometime later. I looked at the House of Assembly journals, and I haven't, up until the 1860s, I haven't encountered the name Queen's Wharf. So. Yes?
You had talked about the boom in horse exports
Yeah.
around the 1850s, I guess it was, and wondered what may have caused that. Now, I was told by another historian, John Cousins, you might know,
Yeah, I know.
that the first settlers come over with oxen. There was no such thing as horses as a beast of burden, so to speak.
And initially that is so, and Andrew Hill Clark in his book, 3 Centuries in the Island, talks about the transition from oxen to horses. By 1815, horses had definitely outstripped the number of oxen, and the number of oxen continued to slide quite dramatically.
So that might explain the boom then around that
Well,
era,
yeah,
similar to when tractor replaced the workhorse.
they sure did. But it took a long while. I mean, even in my youth, well, that was a long time. But we had a cottage on a farm in Cavendish, and the oldest gentleman on the farm, Jeremiah Simpson, he still farmed with horses, but his son had a tractor. I can remember going haying with Jeremiah behind a horse. So. Even in my lifetime, can you imagine?
I would imagine a horse would be a little smarter than an oxen.
Never. I've never seen oxen in use in Prince Edward.
I mean, that's going way back anyway.
Yeah. Yes.
What about mining in Nova Scotia? Would they have taken
I beg your pardon?
What about mining in Nova Scotia? Would they have taken horses, small horses?
What, pit ponies, you mean?
Yeah.
Possibly. It may well have been, and as I say, it's an area that I haven't looked into, but that is something I hadn't thought of, and it's worth looking into.
What years specifically, Harry, were the horses turning up? 1850s?
The mid-1850s, 1853 to 1858. And then it levels off a bit. There'd always been a lot of shipping of cattle to Newfoundland, but most of that seemed to be out of Charlottetown. And as I say, the distance from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick was relatively small. You could load a number of horses onto the deck of a schooner and sail for less than a day and offload them when you got to the other side. So a lot of the problems you have with shipping livestock are maintaining them while at sea. And Prince Edward Island is fortunate in that the distance is not great, but that's simply a reason how easy it would be, but it doesn't really account for why the market suddenly burst from 40 or 50 horses a year to 300 and some horses a year.
Do the records show where the horses were going?
No, unfortunately, I haven't had a chance. If you went into the individual shipping records, which are sporadic, but the compilations which are in the journals of the House Assembly, they mention only the destination in terms of other colonies. Later, by the 1870s, you start to get more information about where they're going, but by that time, the horses had calmed down a little.
The census records for Lot 25 and 26, which is north of Bedeque, Bedeque Bay,
Yeah,
and
Searletown.
south survived both those years.
Yeah.
And it's possible to see the change in agriculture over just 20 years. In the Freetown area, in 1840, there are fewer settlers, and they record, the census records the proportion of each farm that is cleared, and it's of the order of 20 or 30%. And say there are 20 farms. 20 years later, the whole land is occupied, and the amount of cleared land is about 60–80% of each farm.
Yeah,
And all
the woods have disappeared.
Yeah, very quickly, within 20 years, as there was a rapid fill-up of the interior, or the people moved in. And the island was filled by 1860, and people had to go elsewhere, or sometimes up west, there was fair land. But in that same census, oats is recorded. It's the main crop that every farmer in the 1860 census is recording in large amounts.
There are some surprises in those figures. I remember a couple of years ago, I was doing research, and I came across a report of Prince Edward Island being that great egg-producing country. And in the late 1870s, early 1880s, Prince Edward Island was supplying something like 20% of the eggs consumed in Boston. And interestingly enough, one of the ways to ship eggs so they didn't get broken was to ship them in barrels of oats.
What attracted your ancestor, R.T. Holman, to Bedeque Bay, the Summerside?
It was a rising town. R.T. Holman started off in Charlottetown, and he had a brother who was a merchant in Charlottetown. He was killed in an accident in New England, and his other brother, James Ludlow Holman, who started the tourism business on Prince Edward Island. There's a plaque on the Summerside waterfront. So he worked with him and started, but Summerside was a rising town. It was a growing town, and as I mentioned, one of the reports, and those were just a selection, it wasn't all about how awful it looked and how awful the people were. There were a lot of reports of how industrious Summerside was and how busy and how it was growing, and it was a growth center, and continued to be a growth center for a very long time. It was a busy, busy town. Yeah.
Just a comment, it's later history, but I recall around the 1960s, my father was in livestock and that sort of thing, and he actually collected livestock, ponies and cattle to go to St. Pierre and Miquelon.
Oh, yeah. There always was a trade to Newfoundland, so I'm not surprised that some of that might have gone to St. Pierre as well.
Yeah.
Question with regard to the oats again. In the 1860s, did PEI start to supply the energy source for the American Civil War?
No,
Okay.
not so much. If it wasn't much of a bump. Actually, the American Civil War coincided with an increase in shipping to Great Britain. And actually, the shipping to the United States dropped considerably because of the end of reciprocity. For one thing, it coincided with the Civil War. And they didn't have a lot of money to spend outside the country. But there obviously was some economic spin-off for Prince Edward Island, but it wasn't significant.
Well, thank you, Harry. Oh, there's one question.
That you mentioned Hurd's Wharf, which interests me. I can remember talking to older residents in the area that remember seeing the carts and the farmers lined up along that road
Okay, well,
for shipping
yeah.
off Herd's Wharf. So I'm not, maybe someone here might have an idea when that stopped.
Well, they were still shipping in small schooners for the maritime market well into the 1940s.
Okay, that's why this.
So it's not surprising that they would be lined up in the fall of the year
Okay.
with produce. At that time, they were probably shipped transitioning to potatoes. But you know, they shipped from wherever they could. And even though the wharf facilities at Herd's Point were not particularly great, they were accessible, and you didn't have to go all the way around to Summerside. Yeah.
My grandmother used to tell a story about farmers loading oats on ships at Herd's Point to go to Boston.
Yeah.
And typically the oats was transported by horse and cart. And she said it wasn't uncommon for when a ship was in to have a horse and carts lined up for nearly a mile, waiting to get rid of the load of oats.
Oh yeah, it would be very slow to load, and because the carts would be fairly small farm carts.
Yes.
Mostly two-wheel carts, tip carts. And I don't know whether they were shipped in bags or barrels, because a lot of shipping was in barrels at the time as opposed to bags. I mean, we have PEI bag company, we don't have PEI barrel company. Stands to reason. Okay.
Well, thank you, Harry. That is terrific. Well, we've covered not only we've had all the questions have been about shipping, but it was also fascinating the journal of Horatio Mann and his journeys from the 1820s to the 1840s and recording. He was recording the changing landscape as well, and the developing connections in Bedeque and roads developing. So, in appreciation, we
Thank you.
that. Thank you. Thank you. I want to just make a few announcements, and there are refreshments at the back. You can even go back now and get them while I'm talking. But I want to first of all talk about next week's talk in a little bit of detail, and the others you'll find on the list. Next week we're having Dr. Alan McEachern of the University of Western Ontario speaking on the topic of a recent book called Becoming Green Gables. And it's about the house, Green Gables, how that ordinary farmhouse that had existed for, perhaps a century before it officially became Green Gables, how it became a tourist attraction, and of the family that lived in it, the Webb family. And so it's a fascinating book to read. He'll have it here next week for sale. And the topic is about the family that lived in the house, the Webb family, and how they coped with the house gradually becoming famous. Thanks. Just a few other announcements. We have a hot roast turkey dinner Friday, July 24th in the United Church. This is the third annual. They've got 100 seats only. It's $35 per person, and the tickets can be bought from either tonight or by booking through the museum. And it is usually it was a sellout in the 2 years that we've held it. So get your tickets early. We have memberships to the museum. $25 for individuals, $30 for families. It supports the work of the museum. It gives you free access to the museum during the summer season and by appointment later with no charge. also you get the newsletters and all the mailings from the museum as well. Another fundraiser we had, we're always looking for funds. We have a seafood raffle, very generously supported by the prizes have been donated by Waddell's Ship Mart of Summerside, $250 voucher for whatever choice of seafood you wish. You don't have to buy it all at one time. You can, and you don't have to be present for the draw, and you can also live off the island and eat your seafood next summer. It's $250 for first prize. The second prize is $125 worth of oysters, and you have to buy them all at once. It comes in a packet, I think. They don't usually arrange to give it in installments. And the third prize is a $50 seafood. The Future Seafoods gives the $125 voucher for oysters. And we're very pleased they're still able to do that with the disease that is affecting all island oysters more or less now. And the $50 voucher from Waddell. So it's a $5 ticket or 3 for $10. Those are the announcements. The Holman Island, yes, the Holman Island tours. Last year, the last 2 years, they've been very successful. 100 people took the tour 2 years ago, 80 last year. This year we're having 4 days. It all depends on the tides in the afternoon. The tide has to be low in the afternoon, and that means it's only once in the month. It's July 25th and 26th in the afternoon, 3 p.m., 4 p.m., and August 25th and 26th, 3:30 p.m. and 4 p.m. again. The ticket for it is adults $40, young people $30. I thought when we set those prices, islanders wouldn't pay for it, but we've had an excellent response, and it's been a good fundraiser. And the first year it was led by Kaylee Curry, who devised the idea of the tour. She was working here that summer, a year and a half with us. And last summer I continued it, and it's not just a walking tour around the island. You'll get a full history lesson right from before European settlement up to the late 19th century anyway, and the development of Summerside. And there are no mosquitoes on the water either. And on a hot day it's cool, and so it's actually quite pleasant. Last year we had a perfect 6 days for it. We went in June as well. So those are all the activities. There's a chance to, I'm sure Harry will answer questions individually if you have other questions here. And please enjoy the refreshments at the back. And please come back next week and tell your friends as well about it.